Kind of eliminated it.
Yeah. See, I'm still debating if he has we're getting another Chinese. The goddamn Chinese won't be good. They're fucking great.
You want to have like something like that.
Nothing goes wrong with them, bro. I don't understand why people keep saying this shit to me.
But like, what if
What phone do I have? You don't know.
I don't know what it is. I don't see it.
You see it, right? You have no clue what the fuck it is, right? I've had
Has
it
a
for
touch
2 years. Yeah, it's smart. I've had it for 2 years. It's never lagged. There's been 2 occasions where it forced shut down for some reason. That's it. Two occasions. I'll be on power channel.
I wouldn't pick it.
I tried it only.
It is a game, bro.
But I hate power.
Oggi è lavorando.
Just Google that shit, bro. That's 20 minutes old.
Yeah, better.
Nah, I got Billy's only Billy physically cannot teach a class past 1 p.m. Hello. So yeah, I have politics, 327. It's comparative foreign politics. Yeah, we look at countries as case studies and we just go into the whys and whys and what's stuff. We spent the first half of the term just talking about America. Bro, I swear to God, Rami, if you walk into this course, you would just fucking come. He could not. Like, so many things the boss said, like, I'm literally going to debate about Rami. He was watching the same YouTube video. Vice documentaries. What do you have to test for? I know you just told me.
Islam.
Like, what do you even, like, is it a history course? Is it like...
It is a history course.
Okay, so it's not about Islam.
It is.
About,
It is.
Okay, it's about Islam.
It's like both. You know?
What did they ask you?
What was the prophet?
When? Let me guess. 441 AD, 450 AD.
That's it.
Shit.
Okay. And it's like when was he born? When did he die? When did he go to?
When did he die? Okay, let me guess this. He died at the age of 60. 60. Oh shit. I was so close for both of those. Fuck, bro. I'm a bad Muslim.
I don't know when to tell you.
I mean, obviously, obviously, yeah. Damn. But what else did they ask? That's it? They asked about Ali?
What happened? Why did the prophet go to?
Oh my god, bro, that's dope. It's like Islamic studies in school.
Exactly, bro. Exactly. Islamic studies, it's exactly.
And it's a religion credit?
Well, technically, it's
I mean, yes, religion will be a subject. And it's first year?
second.
Oh, no prerequisites? Oh,
Yeah, I was like, okay.
okay. Okay.
What are the 5 pillars of Islam? It's like, bro, it's like
Yeah,
stuff
easy.
you learn, like
Yeah.
literally you just learn.
Peanuts, bro. I was thinking I would do Arabic. I'd do, but we don't offer it in yet. Somebody's speaking.
My phone just like, bro, I was jumping.
I did not expect to see you.
Bro, all of a sudden it just started ringing out. If she talks in your ear, she like announces the contact name. She's like, call from. I was like, who are you?
Yeah, fuck that. Dude, the new ones are so nice.
These are like,
I know everything about that. I'm Geek Squad. Fucking Geek Squad. But yeah, Yahya's a new one? Did his daddy take him from him?
no. His dad's actually like,
Calm down, man.
he's,
Yeah, I mean, they tried. They tried putting their foot up his ass and it didn't work. Yeah. He was like, you got another foot? Maybe try that one.
Drop.
Yeah. Drop kick it inside my ass.
okay, go ahead, discuss.
Yeah. I'll ask you the 5 minutes of Islam. What? I'll ask you for the 5 minutes of Islam.
Sit somewhere over there. No problem.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, thank you.
I'm here tomorrow. Yeah.
Right after your session. Oh, wait, Sarah.
I'm sort of a visiting teacher. So I'll just come and visit. Oh no?
Oh, right. Sorry. I'm not.
I know you guys are like best friends, so I was trying to be considerate.
That much I know.
And once you learn how piano, it's easy to translate to other tools.
Brian Hardy.
Oh, yeah, I know what you're saying. It's a dude, it's a girl. Subtractor.
Is it like coincides with my no need to change all this. Yes, I can call with the manager. Basically said that if I were to go for those 2 weeks,
I just
sorry,
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
I have.
You have that? It's not green. You can actually green left. Oh, yeah, different.
Yeah.
Oh, it's, yeah, it's really close. I have a car.
Oh, I saw that.
Yeah, I'm just the male one.
Yeah. It was like this huge battle against them because it would like back then just to cut its head.
No, I did the military. I did the mill part of the
And he got shot.
first one.
He got shot. That's a 7.
I got the marks left. I got a good deep card back, basically. Like,
1.5 out of 5 is 7.
That's fair. I forgot.
He got shot by like this crazy Christian lawmakers when they
My friend's son
What if I didn't have already?
no, I know I'm horrible. How did you meet
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Before I begin today's class, let me, as I usually do, see whether there's anyone that has any questions or comments about anything that we've touched on so far before we go into new material. If not, just want to comment on a couple of things that relate to this class, at least tangentially. It's, as I'm sure you found, been rather frightening watching the news in the last little while, for a whole slew of reasons. One of which is that we are obviously seeing the country of India descending into open fascism, which is indeed rather frightening. Given the record of the current Prime Minister of India, Modi, whose background as the Premier of Gujarat has a rather scary precedent. In his occupation of that office, there were over 1,000 Muslims massacred, in which his government appeared to be quite complicit. So much so that the U.S. government declared him persona non grata, something that had to be lifted very quickly when he was invited to visit the United States by the Trump administration for that Howdy Modi rally that he held in Texas a few months back. The situation there is indeed rather frightening, and seems to again involve the complicity of many of the law enforcement agencies that did not put a stop to the rampaging mobs, the majority of whom appear to be Hindus, with some participation by Muslim mobs as well. Suffice it to say, the situation appears to be spiraling out of control, and that is indeed frightening, given that India is the second largest Muslim country on the planet, with well over 200 million Muslims in the country. It's second only to Indonesia. And in that context, a fascist government that seems to in many ways and rather openly model itself on Nazi Germany is indeed a rather frightening prospect. We'll of course look at that in much more detail as we move forward. The other thing that we should all be thinking about, and that has little to do with, well, it has a lot to do with foreign policy, but that certainly we're going to have to keep our eye on, is this emerging coronavirus. And I say emerging, although it seems to have spread to every corner of the planet at this point, and seems, by all indications, to be largely out of control. And while I'm not particularly worried about Canada's reaction to that, I think Canada's healthcare system is relatively robust and probably will be able to manage this outbreak in a relatively stable manner. I'm deeply worried about the situation down south of the border, where the government seems to be largely ignoring it, or at least the Trump administration seems to be largely ignoring it, although some of the bureaucracies seem to be aware of the threat that is posed, especially the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, that's issued a stark warning on Tuesday, saying that the outbreak is not a matter of if, but when. And the news that's been coming out of the United States is not particularly encouraging. The first case has been discovered outside of San Francisco, a 60-year-old man that has never really traveled and doesn't know anyone that's traveled, and they have no idea where he contacted the virus. And that seems to indicate that what we're seeing in the United States as well as elsewhere around the world is merely the tiny tip of the iceberg. There seem to be far greater infections than we are aware of. And most of the evidence seems to suggest that roughly 80% of those that are infected end up having no symptoms whatsoever, or very mild symptoms, but nonetheless are capable of passing on the disease. And that essentially means that it's uncontainable. And how this will play itself out is very much an open question. Now, what's particularly worrisome about that is that Mr. Obama, when he was president, was convinced as a result of the outbreak of Ebola to update American preparedness for this kind of pandemic and created a pandemic readiness organization that essentially brought together the National Security Council, the Center for Disease Control, the Health and Human Services, and various other branches of the government that would have to be involved in reacting to a pandemic, including the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Commerce, because all of these would have to coordinate to a certain extent in a way that you can probably imagine if you think about what happened in China. China, and in many ways we should count ourselves lucky that the outbreak started in China, because it was able to shut down the entire city of Wuhan, a city of 11 million, completely. And what was required in order to do that, and to do that for several weeks, is a coordinated response on the part of the entire Chinese government to supply the city that was entirely shut down with food and so on and so forth. Something that is rather difficult to imagine in the United States without major coordination among different branches of the government. Then came the election of Donald Trump. And Donald Trump essentially fired all those people that were hired as a pandemic response unit by Obama and didn't bother replacing them. And that means that the United States is entirely unprepared for this. Furthermore, he immediately cried foul when the Center for Disease Control announced that this was an impending pandemic and that Americans should get ready and should get ready for major disruptions in their daily lives as a response to this. All of which does not bode well that the United States is well prepared for this. I don't want to scare anyone too drastically, and we're certainly lucky to be on the north side of the border. But I could foresee a scenario in which this very quickly spins out of control in the United States, whereupon Donald Trump will announce that this is a state of emergency, impose martial law, and cancel the 2020 elections. Now, again, this is far-fetched at this point, but it certainly is in keeping with the personality of Donald Trump and the extent to which things are spinning out of control without any real institutional means of dealing with them certainly suggests that things are going to get pretty ugly down there. I sure hope I'm wrong on this, and I hope you all think that I'm out to lunch and that this all proves to be completely wrong. Suffice it to say, it's something that we're going to have to keep our eyes on, and that certainly bears keeping our attention on, in part also because we have to kind of prepare ourselves for whatever the response may be. As has already occurred in South Korea, in parts of Europe, insofar as authorities want to slow this process down, want to slow the spread of this disease down, which is probably the only response that we can have at this point, since a vaccine is at least a year or so away. One of the things that's obvious is that you shut down all of the vectors that would allow this disease to spread more rapidly. And we're standing in one of the prime vectors right now. Universities are places where people come from far away and join together and then spread out into other areas. In other words, I don't think it's altogether impossible that we will see large school closures and things along those lines in Canada as well. Hopefully, our class will be long over by then, and we'll be on summer vacation and all of that kind of stuff, but we can't count on that. This thing's developing very quickly. We don't have to worry about that in this course, because whatever happens to this course will happen to the entire university, so we'll just go on as if things were normal for the time being. Let me return to where we left off last class when we began to discuss German foreign policy. While we are today scheduled to get to the UK, and I will get there, we're still in the process of getting caught up to where we are supposed to be in the syllabus. By next week, I hope to be entirely caught up so that we can spend a full time allotted to the last two case studies of Indian foreign policy and Chinese foreign policy, given the importance of those two countries in global affairs these days. With regard to German foreign policy, what I tried to explore last week is, on the one hand, the origin of the German state. And in that regard, we looked at the rise of the German state in the center of Europe under the dominance of the Prussian state and the lack of a democratic tradition in Germany until its defeat in World War I. And its defeat in World War I gave rise to the Weimar Republic, which proved to be rather unstable. Not necessarily because of the failure of those institutions or because of the poor design of those institutions, but to a substantial extent, as I suggested, because democracy arrived in Germany as a result of the defeat in war. In other words, at the insistence of the occupying or the victorious powers, in particular the United States. It did not enjoy the support of large portions of the institutions that are crucial to maintaining democracy, including the military in particular, and the judiciary. And of course, it was established under circumstances under which almost any democratic system would have a difficult time maintaining stability. In other words, the economic circumstances were such that the success of the Weimar Republic always, from the outset, had a large question mark behind it. Suffice it to say, however, that the creation of democracy after the Second World War in Germany reflected some important components of the perceived flaws of the Weimar Republic. So let me briefly talk about the institutions of German governance since that time, in order to shed some more light on the nature of the making of foreign policy. I don't want to spend too much time on that since we're not dealing with a course on German institutions, but it is certainly important to understand at least the basis of the making of foreign policy within that context. In essence, the Weimar Republic was a purely parliamentary system based on proportional representation. Proportional representation is a system in which the country votes as a single unit, and seats in the parliament, in this case the Reichstag, are distributed on the basis of the percentage of the vote received in the national vote. One of the problems with that, that I discussed briefly last class, is that proportional representation leads to the possibility that relatively small splinter parties can capture 2, 3, 5% of the vote, and consequently make it more and more difficult to form majorities. Meaning that in order to form majority governments, coalitions have to be formed among larger numbers of parties. And whenever one party is dissatisfied with a particular decision, they can pull out of that coalition and bring the government down. In that regard, that dynamic explained the extreme instability of governments during the Weimar Republic, in particular during those periods of crisis in the early phases prior to 1923, and in the aftermath of the crash of the stock market in 1929. In the year prior to the seizure of power by Adolf Hitler, Germany had elections almost every month and a half. In order to rectify that, the Bonn Republic, the basic law that was established in West Germany that has since become the constitution for the entire German state, was a reaction to those perceived weaknesses. First of all, the experience of the Nazi regime was seen as a problem of far too greatly concentrated power. In order to avoid the concentration of power in that similar manner, Germany was once again turned into a federalist entity. A federalist entity in which the powers of government are divided between a central government and the various regional governments, called in Germany Länder. You have to remember that. In respect to that new federalist structure, Germany adopted a bicameral legislature consisting of two houses, the Bundestag and the Bundesrat. Again, you don't have to remember the spelling of those. It's not so closely related to foreign policy. Suffice it to say that the Bundesrat is the lower house. Bund stands for federation. Rat does not mean a rat, it means advice in German. Within the Bundesrat, the representation is based on the elections within the state governments. But the Bundesrat does not have a major function in formulating policy. It's in that regard equivalent to the Senate in Canada. The most important institution is the Bundestag, which functions as the parliament in Germany. The Bundestag is elected on the basis of a rather complex system, again in response to the perceived flaws of the Weimar Republic. You don't have to memorize the election system. Suffice it to say that one analyst argued that if you see the Parliament of Great Britain as a rover, then the German system is somewhat more equivalent to a BMW, somewhat more sophisticated technologically, and so on and so forth. In other words, basically, it functions on the basis of a system of proportional representation for half of the seats in the Bundestag, while the other half of the seats are based on a single-member constituency system, in which the entire country is divided up into equal voting districts, each of which elects a representative from that voting district. It's more complicated than that, however. If it were merely left to that, essentially the biggest two parties would be heavily overrepresented because those single-member constituency seats, just as is the case in Canada, tend to be captured by the top two parties. In order to prevent the top two parties from being overrepresented, therefore, the proportional representation seats are distributed in such a way to make sure that the overall outcome would be the same as if the whole thing had been done by proportional representation. Now, you might well ask, why bother? The reason is essentially to weaken the leadership of parties. In other words, to give at least half of the seats in the Bundestag an independent base of power from their party leadership. Their role is to represent their constituency, not necessarily to represent their party. Somewhat equivalent to the way representation works in the United States. Indeed, in this regard, the German system is a kind of a hybrid between British parliamentary systems and the U.S. System of government. The Bundestag, in turn, elects the Chancellor, who is the main figure in German politics. Germany also has a president, who is appointed through a complex process that you don't need to bother yourselves with. And suffice it to say that the role of the president is essentially equivalent to the role of the Queen in the United Kingdom or the Governor General in Canada. In other words, it's largely a symbolic position. In order to further stabilize the system, they also added what has become known as the 5% clause. And the 5% clause essentially prevents any party that gets less than 5% of the national vote from getting any representation in the Bundestag at all. In essence, that was a means of keeping splinter groups out of politics and therefore making it easier to form larger coalitions. That system has been relatively stable since its inception in the late 1940s, and has given rise to a relatively stable collection of parties, first dominated by the two largest parties, the Christian Democratic Union I put CDU, CSU, because the Christian Democratic Party is divided between the Christian Democratic Party and the Christian Social Union. The Christian Social Union is the Bavarian counterpart of the Christian Democratic Party, and that is a reflection of the different religious makeup of southern Germany from northern Germany. Northern Germany is predominantly Protestant, Bavaria is predominantly Catholic. Other than that, it has little significance. Suffice it to say, however, that one of the problems that emerged more recently that has made this somewhat controversial is that Angela Merkel, the current Chancellor of Germany, as most of you are probably aware, was relatively open to accepting refugees and immigrants into Germany. The Bavarian wing of the party, however, was strongly opposed to that, and in that sense, it came close to Angela Merkel being brought down by members of her own party in a couple of years ago when this issue came to a head. In that regard, there are some differences in terms of the orientations of those two wings of the Christian Democratic Party. The other major party is the Social Democratic Party, SPD. The D in this case stands for Deutschland, Sozialdemokratische Partei Deutschlands, which is, as the title suggests, a social democratic party, roughly equivalent to the Liberal Party in Canada, although perhaps slightly further to the left. Finally, among the dominant parties that emerged initially was the FDP, the Free Democratic Party, which is a liberal party, but liberal in the German sense or the European sense of that word, meaning, the closest equivalent in North America would be a libertarian party. In other words, very much free market oriented and very, very strongly pro-business. None of these three parties were in the entire history of the German Republic ever able to form a majority government, meaning that all governments that have governed Germany since the Second World War have been coalitions. And generally, as this suggests, it meant that one of the two larger parties teamed up with the FDP. Initially, for the first almost 2 decades of German post-war history, the CDU-CSU governed along with the FDP. First under Konrad Adenauer, and later under his replacement, Ebert. In 1967, the FDP pulled out of the coalition with the CDU and caused the government to collapse. Whereupon the SPD and the CDU briefly formed a coalition with each other in 1968. At the end of 1968, that coalition fell apart, and the SPD joined a coalition with the FDP and governed for the next 10 years. Until once again the FDP pulled out of the coalition and joined a coalition with the CDU to form the government of Helmut Kohl that maintained power until well into the 1990s. One of the upshots of all of this is that while Germans have held periodic elections, elections have never decided what the government actually is. The nature of the government has always been decided by negotiations between the parties as to which party forms a coalition. And governments have always fallen, not as a result of being defeated in elections, but as a result of one of the coalition parties pulling out of the coalition and bringing down the government. Which is not altogether an indication of a system of government very responsive to the interests of its people. Since the 1970s, this system has become a little bit more complicated. In particular, with the rise of the Green Party, which first managed to get over the 5% clause in the late 1970s, but did not form any government with, or was not a large enough party to upset that basic arrangement between the top three parties until well into the 1990s. Added to that, in the aftermath of the German unification, was the PDS, which is the leftover of the governing party in East Germany, the Socialist Unity Party, which calls itself the Party of Democratic Socialism. Finally, in the last couple of years, and in particular in this year, a party known as the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, Alternative für Deutschland, has risen, especially in the regions of Eastern Germany. The AfD is a far right-wing movement that has ideologically strong ties to the Nazi era, and was roundly rejected as a coalition partner from the beginning of all of the other party, by all of the other parties. Most of all of those other parties have throughout German history since the Second World War pledged not to form any kind of partnership with the far right movement. That drastically changed just a couple of months ago when the regional government of Thüringen, under the CDU, decided to form a majority by collaborating with the AfD, which many have argued has to some extent legitimated the AfD in a way that is frightening to those that remember the Nazi legacy of Germany. Let me take a look at the policy outputs in regard to foreign policy that has emerged out of this system and how it has transformed itself over the last several decades. The chief concern of German foreign policy, of German policy more generally, was first and foremost, of course, its economic revival. And in that regard, Germany faced some substantial problems. In essence, while much of German cities were destroyed, most of German industry remained relatively intact at the end of the Second World War. And that meant that the recreation of a functioning German economy required a market larger than the German market was able to supply itself. Meaning Germany from the outset needed to look for export markets in order to rebuild its economy. Nonetheless, on the basis of generous credits and the growing demand for German industrial goods in particular at the end of the Second World War, Germany achieved what has roundly been described as the German economic miracle, whereby the virtually destroyed country of Germany in the late 1940s achieved a standard of living equivalent to its neighbors by the end of the 1950s. A second major concern, and one that has overridden German foreign policy through the first 3 or 4 decades of its history, was the concern with reunification. And that pulled German political forces in very different directions. In essence, the first 2 decades of German history under the government of Konrad Adenauer in collaboration with the FDP drew very close to the United States and to NATO in what might be what in Germany was called Westpolitik. Westpolitik. In other words, the perception was that the best way for Germany for West Germany to assure its own security and to guarantee or achieve the eventual reunification of Germany is to draw as close to the West in the hopes that the West will, in the long run, be able to drive the Soviets out of their strongholds in East Germany and elsewhere further east in Eastern Europe. That, however, did not produce any movement in the direction of German unification. In fact, by 1961, the prospect of German unification became even more distant when the East German government decided to build the Berlin Wall. The reason for that is relatively easy to understand. East Germany was the poorer region of Germany to begin with. Was occupied by the Soviet Union that had suffered the worst consequences of the Second World War, and consequently pretty much took everything that was of any value that wasn't attached to the ground from East Germany back into the Soviet Union, including entire factories and so on. For that reason, for example, you can still buy the old World War II BMWs with the sidecars that you see in those World War II movies in exactly the form that they were designed by Germany back in the Second World War from Russia. They took the entire factory and they're still cranking out those motorcycles to this day. They're called Urals. Not in and of itself important, but what it illustrated is that East Germany essentially became pastoralized by the Soviet Union, with much of its industry removed. And given that the Soviet Union was also not in a position to reconstruct East Germany in the way that the Western countries were with regard to West Germany by offering extensive credits, it meant that the standard of living in East Germany stagnated, while that in West Germany increased phenomenally. And that was a problem, in part because of the status of the city of Berlin. The city of Berlin was likewise divided among the occupying forces, but was an open city. And that meant that anyone in East Germany could travel to Berlin, could walk from East Berlin across the checkpoint Charlie to West Berlin, and immediately receive a West German passport. By virtue of the fact that West Germany did not recognize the legitimacy of the East German government, and therefore considered all East German citizens West German citizens, and was happy to accept them. To a certain extent, that is a little bit, if you think about it, like the United States declaring that they don't recognize the legitimacy of the Mexican government, and therefore all Mexican citizens will be considered American citizens if they can manage to make it across the Rio Grande. Well, what do you think would happen if that were the case? Much of the population of Mexico would flood north, and the Americans would very quickly shut that notion down. Something very similar happened in Germany. In essence, it led to an exodus of East Germans into West Germany, but interestingly, an exodus that was somewhat more selective. In other words, workers were pretty well protected in East Germany, were guaranteed full employment, were guaranteed a relatively acceptable standard of living. But it was the more educated that perceived that they would enjoy a much higher standard of living in West Germany, and correctly so. And consequently, the evidence showed that in the 1950s, the pattern of students that studied in East German universities to become architects, doctors, and so on is that they would graduate and immediately go to Berlin and cross the border into West Germany, which in essence represented a severe brain drain for East Germany. And to a certain extent, a subsidy to the West German system. It's in that context that East Germany put up the wall, not to keep others out of East Germany, but rather to keep its own citizens in. The building of the wall, to a certain extent, demonstrated the futility of a confrontational attitude toward the East as a means of achieving reunification. It also became evident that the CDU became less and less enthusiastic about reunification, in part because it felt that much of the East German population had been thoroughly indoctrinated with Marxism and socialist thought and so on and so forth, and would therefore, in a unified Germany, strengthen the SPD severely. All of that made it evident that unification was not going to happen by that manner. Furthermore, the CDU had, and FDP, had created considerable controversy because the intention of Germany after the Second World War, and indeed the intention of the occupying forces, was to keep Germany demilitarized. In other words, to reduce the capacities of Germany militarily to an absolute minimum. But in the context of the Cold War, having a demilitarized West Germany as the frontline state against Soviet aggression was obviously problematic. And that meant, on the one hand, that the British and the Americans never left, and to this day have major military bases in Germany. I believe to this day the largest number of American soldiers stationed outside of the United States is still in Germany and South Korea, essentially still leftovers of the Cold War. But it resulted in the rearmament of Germany in the 1950s, and the rearmament of Germany in the 1950s resulted in massive demonstrations against that process, especially on university campuses. The implication of that for German foreign policy is that the Westpolitik, as I described it, of the CDU, was replaced with the election of the SPD, or the rise to power, I should say, of the SPD under the leadership of Willy Brandt, by what became known as Ostpolitik. Ostpolitik. What Ostpolitik refers to is essentially something that was adopted by the United States and all Western powers a couple of years later under the name détente. In other words, the perception on the part of the SPD was that the best way to lead to a reintegration of Germany was not through confrontational attitude, but rather through a rapprochement with the Soviet Union, and by association, an opening to the East German government. This took place in the context, and indeed preceded to a certain extent, the perception on the part of the United States, as well as the Soviet Union, that the confrontational nature of the Cold War that had been the norm during the 1950s and 1960s created enormous dangers of miscalculation and of unintentional war between the two sides, and that it was in the best interest of both sides to engage in a kind of rapprochement, a kind of détente as it became known, the outgrowth of which were a series of treaties that tried to stabilize the relationship between the two superpowers, beginning with the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaties, the Outer Space Treaty, which has now been renounced by the Trump administration with its announcement of the creation of a Space Force. The Outer Space Treaty that was signed in 1967 prohibited any kind of armaments being put into orbit, as well as the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. This led to a kind of a normalization of the relationship between East and West Germany, but by no means did it lead to the reunification of Germany. That had to wait until the late 1980s and took place under very different circumstances. Perhaps the most important component of German foreign policy has to do with its economic interests. In particular, with its turn to Europe, or as some analysts and historians have put it, its escape into Europe. Although the ECSC, the European Coal and Steel Community that we talked about a couple of classes ago, was a joint project of the French and the Germans, as well as Belgians, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and Italy that were involved in it. One could argue that the entire European project, to a large extent, is a German project. Germany required access to foreign markets and required enormous access to drive its industrial system, to resources, among the most important of which were energy resources. In that regard, an escape into Europe provided them an opportunity to gain access to foreign markets that otherwise would be difficult to access, and also to resources in the rest of Europe. Germany to this day remains the largest export economy on the planet on a per capita basis. It is enormously heavily dependent on exports. That in and of itself should raise some questions. How could Germany, that has over the years developed a very high standard of living, has very high wages for its workers, enormous benefits for its workers from cradle to grave more or less, provides all of its workers with at least 6 weeks of vacation per year, and generous retirement benefits, and a lot of holidays on top of that, and provides free health care and so on and so forth. How can a country like that continue to be competitive on world markets in exports? All of the logics would seem to indicate that to be competitive on world markets, you have to reduce your costs to the absolute minimum and drive down wages and so on and so forth. How could Germany succeed in these kinds of markets with that kind of social system and the tax base that's needed to support it? The answer to that is a complicated one, but has a great deal to do with what is called corporatism. Although Germany never officially adopted corporatism, for reasons that are somewhat complicated. Corporatism emerged essentially out of the fascist governments in Europe, in particular Italy and Germany. And it refers to essentially organizing a state in such a way that all sectors of the society are represented within the state, and policy is coordinated with each of those components of the economy. In other words, that the state itself is organized like a big corporation, in which each sector is organized into peak associations, and each of those peak associations is given direct representation within the state and a role in shaping policy. So that there's a peak association for farmers, there's a peak association for labor in the form of labor federations, and there's a peak association for industry. And essentially foreign policy is ironed out between each of those players in a way that is more effective and more efficient than constant labor disputes between labor and capital and so on and so forth, as is generally practiced in liberal democracies. Corporatism was a key component of the Nazi system, and for that reason was officially rejected after the defeat of Germany. It's interesting that several other countries in Europe, however, have adopted that corporatism, probably most notably Austria. Austria adopted a system of corporatism in the early 1960s, and it reduced its labor disputes from almost constant realities to very exceptional. Austria, like many countries in terms of gauging labor stability, measures its labor conflicts in strikes per day, or strike days per year. And in the aftermath of adopting corporatism, they started to measure them in strike hours per year, signifying a drastic reduction in strikes as a result of that kind of cooperation or representation that allows for greater cooperation. The occupying powers in Germany were quite clearly not keen on reintroducing this kind of a system in Germany, and consequently insisted that no such institutions be created. But to replace those kinds of institutions, and to a certain extent to weaken the corporations in Germany, that had heavily cooperated with the Nazi regime, they introduced a system that became known as Mitbestimmung. Mitbestimmung. Mitbestimmung basically boils down to this. Every major German producer, every major company that employs more than 500 workers has to have 49% of their workers, 49% of their board of directors under the control of the representatives of their workers. Which essentially means that the shareholders that make up the other 51% still have control of the company. Certainly labor cannot override the shareholders. But what it does do is it opens the books to labor unions and consequently allows for labor unions to become part of the decision-making process of corporations. And among the benefits of that is that labor unions were very quickly convinced that in order for German corporations to remain competitive on world markets, they had to accept some outsourcing of certain aspects of production in order to reduce the labor costs of German products on world markets. Did that lead to the kind of outsourcing that took place in the United States, hollowing out the working class and the middle class and leaving many people in debt? No, it didn't. And the reason for that is that while labor unions were convinced to endorse outsourcing, and in that sense globalization, they were also powerful enough to insist that if this particular unit has to be outsourced to reduce costs, we're going to insist that you invest enough money within Germany to make sure that the employment levels in Germany stay the same. And by a combination of these methods, Germany has maintained its international competitiveness at the same time as being able to maintain a fairly high standard of living and a high standard of or high level of benefits for its working classes. Germany's dependence on exports meant that the European Union was absolutely crucial to German economic recovery. And for that reason, Germany has been the main force pushing the European project forward. And indeed it was Germany that pushed for the Maastricht Treaty that created the European Union and was the chief architect behind the European Monetary Union. Now, arguably, the European Monetary Union was a fiasco, and still is a fiasco. It's proved to be a considerable disaster in particular for countries like Greece, Spain, Portugal, and Italy that have developed a serious balance of payments deficits with Germany. Germany exporting far more to those regions than they import from those regions or than their tourists spend in those regions. But it has been an enormous success for Germany. Now, many at the time of the European Monetary Union were arguing that this was premature, that it represented or that was likely to destabilize the entire system. And indeed, for precisely the reasons for which the European Union is now in trouble. The productivity levels between Greece and Portugal and Germany are so different that the problem that emerged was relatively easy to predict. What was required for a monetary union was essentially a kind of a super state in Europe that was able to deal with these kinds of problems the way that Canada or the United States do. In other words, when a province within Canada finds itself in bankruptcy or finds its income declining drastically, there are equalization payments made by Ottawa to bail out that province and to keep it from going bankrupt. In the European Union, there's no such equivalence. And consequently, countries like Greece and Italy and Portugal and Spain were largely left to their own devices. Now, why would Germany pursue the European Monetary Union and push it forward, given that these problems were relatively self-evident? The answer to that is relatively easy to explain, and has everything to do with economics. Germany is an enormously powerful export economy, and one that has a substantial trade surplus with other regions of the world, had the natural tendency of pushing the value of the German mark upward. And as the German mark became more expensive, its exports on foreign markets became less competitive. By transitioning to the euro, Germany largely bypassed that problem. Not only did it have easy access to European markets, but the exchange rate for the euro is determined by the overall productivity and the overall demand for European products on world markets, not by the productivity or the overall demand for German products on world markets. And that meant that the overall exchange rate of the euro was always going to be substantially lower than Germany's own currency was, meaning that Germany made out like a bandit from the European Monetary Union. And that obviously has created substantial resentment in other regions of Europe to that system that has so drastically benefited Germany. Germany, in that regard, achieved in many ways by economic means and by peaceful means in the aftermath of the Second World War, what it had failed to achieve by military means in the previous several decades. In other words, to become the dominant power within Europe. Now, let me briefly talk about unification and the implications that unification had. The unification of Germany took place in 1989, as most of you know, with the falling of the wall. But the reason for the unification is in many ways complex, but in many ways not as complex as it would initially appear. It, of course, has everything to do with the declining power of the Soviet Union and its inability to exercise full control over its sphere of influence, including East Germany. But not just including East Germany, including also countries like Hungary. Hungary, most particularly, was always a country that seemed to have a slightly looser relationship with the Soviet Union, a slightly more flexible government. But in 1988, Hungary announced that it was opening its border with the neighboring Austria. And that created enormous problems. In essence, East German citizens do not require a visa to travel to Hungary. And that meant that East Germans could jump in their crappy little East German cars and drive to Hungary, and drive from there across the border into Austria, and then we're in the West and were welcomed in the West with a German passport. Essentially, once again, opening up that easy route into West Germany. West Germany maintained that open relationship to East Germany, especially after the building of the wall, in large part because it served all of its ideological purposes. The fact that there were still a few people jumping across the wall and risking their lives to make it into West Germany always played well in West Germany and seemed to verify how much more civilized and how much better off West Germans were. But that would have been very difficult to maintain if it wasn't merely 10 or 20 people that made that trip a year, but hundreds or even thousands or even hundreds of thousands. And the opening of the border by Hungary essentially allowed for a massive flood of East Germans through Hungarian territory. The Hungarians complained about this and said something had to be done about that, but were not willing to shut down their border with East Germany. And West Germany was also not willing to shut down its border with Hungary. And consequently, the East German government responded, okay, in that case, we'll open up the wall. And that's how the wall came down. Now, why would the East German government do that? Were they just stupid? Did they just give up? Well, the easy answer is that they anticipated the results of what I kind of described in the suggestion that the United States might have a similar attitude toward Mexico. Obviously, they couldn't sustain that. And the expectation on the part of the East German government, in all likelihood, was that once the floodgates were open, and once tens of thousands flooded through West Berlin into West Germany, the West Germans would very quickly say, whoa, we can't handle that, and shut down the border themselves. And in doing so, recognize the East German state, the East German citizenship, and normalize relations in the way that relations between German-speaking Austria and German-speaking Germany are normal and don't cause any real problems. What the East German government didn't seem to anticipate was the determination of Helmut Kohl in particular, and the Americans to bring down the East German regime and to tolerate that far longer than was anticipated, meaning essentially brought down the East German government. The problems that the East German government anticipated would prevent the West Germans from being able to take over, of course, were very real. As soon as the wall came down, there was a massive flood of East Germans into West Germany. Driving up rents in West Germany substantially, increasing housing prices in West Germany, driving up competition for jobs in West Germany extensively, and creating a major backlash against East Germans. A major backlash that still lasts to this day, and that to some extent explains why far-right parties have risen in East Germany in response to their integration into the West. The result of that was that West Germany, or the German government rather, had to invest massively in East Germany in order to prevent that exodus of East Germans. Had to invest massively in upgrading their infrastructure, in developing industries and so on and so forth, much of which was largely useless. In essence, they built an enormous infrastructure for industries that never materialized. They built enormous office blocks for the businesses that never materialized and that to this day stand empty. But in the process, came close to bankrupting Germany in its entirety. And it's to a large extent the experience of Germany with East Germany that has prevented the European Union from rapidly expanding eastward as well. It's the example of the extent to which the rapid integration of a formerly socialist economy into a functioning and rather efficient capitalist economy that convinced much of the European Union that if it was to expand eastward, it would have to do so at a much slower rate. And that in turn, of course, meant that in order to reassure the East Europeans that they would not fall once again into the orbit of Russia, NATO was expanded eastward as an alternative to the eastward expansion of the European Union. Let me talk a little bit more before we end up our discussion of Germany in regard to Germany's other foreign policy initiatives. It has, of course, been consistently tied very closely to NATO. But within NATO has had a special status in that the German Constitution prevented Germans from deploying any military forces outside of their territory, outside of Europe. And that meant Germany's participation in NATO was always somewhat problematic. In 1994, the Supreme Court in Germany reinterpreted Article 87 that prohibited the stationing of German troops in hostilities outside of German territory to essentially allow this for self-defense and collective self-defense. And that allowed for Germany to participate in the intervention in Yugoslavia and Kosovo in 1999. It has also led to Germany participating in other military ventures, starting with Afghanistan. Interestingly, the Germans were among the states of old Europe that rejected George Bush's call to invade Iraq. And while Germany was not front and center in the European project of undermining the government of Colonel Gaddafi in Libya, it nonetheless participated as a member of NATO. In that regard, Germany has become increasingly a conventional state, no longer constrained to the same extent that it had been over the previous 50 years by its historical record under Nazi Germany, as a aggressor. Currently, German foreign policy is once again becoming somewhat, or German politics more generally, is becoming less stable. The CDU under Angela Merkel has provided a considerable amount of stability. She has maintained herself in power for well over a decade and has become sort of the matriarch of German politics. But she announced that she would not seek re-election in the next elections, and had selected a successor to take her place. I won't bother trying to get you to remember her name, Karrenbauer, who unfortunately was tied up in the movement of the Christian Democratic Party in Turingen, to collaborate with the AfD, and consequently was essentially gave up her ambitions to become the replacement of Angela Merkel. And that basically means that there is no easy replacement in the Christian Democratic Party for Angela Merkel, and there's no obvious successor. And this is in the context of a renewed splintering of parties within Germany that has once again made it rather difficult to form coalitions. In that regard, German politics once again has a substantial question mark behind it in terms of where it is moving in the future. Let me leave German foreign policy at that for the moment, and apologize that I've taken much too long for German foreign policy, and we'll probably have to therefore shortchange our discussion of Britain and France slightly, and turn our attention now to British foreign policy. Again, with regard to British foreign policy, to understand British foreign policy, we have to understand it in its historical context, both in terms of the institutions of British government and in terms of British political culture. The historical context in that regard is that the British state emerged in a way that was somewhat more fortuitous than its European neighbors, in large part by virtue of the fact of its geography. The fact that England was on an island and was therefore protected from most of its major competitors by a substantial moat allowed Britain to focus more on consolidating power within its own territory, and prevented the necessity for maintaining large landed militaries to protect their territory. That in turn allowed Britain instead to put many of its resources into the expansion of its naval power. And its naval power in turn facilitated the rise of Great Britain as a world hegemon. It facilitated it in that, as Alfred Mahan put it, the rimlands and control of the oceans are the crucial component toward establishing world domination. But also in that the control of the oceans provided Britain with ideal circumstances to fuel its process of industrialization. The two, to a certain extent, go hand in hand. Britain is generally credited as being the first country in the world to undergo the process that we now know as industrialization. And industrialization in Great Britain took place largely in the textile industry. The textile industry converted merchant capital into industrial capital. In essence, Britain in the 16th century had become one of the dominant merchant powers and had developed a substantial amount of trade, in particular with Portugal and Spain, supplying the demands of Portugal and Spain for the best textiles available in Europe that were produced by British craftspeople. The British crafts, or the British textile industry was at the time governed by the guild system that controlled every aspect of the production, distribution, and sale of textiles within Britain, including who could become a tailor, what kind of training they had to undergo to become tailors, what kind of materials could be used, the quality of those materials, the prices that could be charged for those materials, the prices that could be charged for the final product, and so on and so forth. In that sense, the textile industry was governed by the guild system in the same way that the guild system controlled blacksmithery, breweries, bakeries, and so on and so forth. It was all part of a fairly integrated and largely self-sufficient economic system that prevailed prior to industrialization. It's in that context that the drastic increase in demand for British woolen goods that resulted from the influx of gold and silver into the Portuguese and Spanish economies threw off that balance. In essence, merchants were attempting to enrich themselves by getting access to greater quantities of textiles to sell to their foreign markets, but couldn't do so given the restrictions of that guild system that did not allow that system to expand. Consequently, the merchants in Britain took the first step toward industrialization in the form of developing what became known as the putting out system. The putting out system converted merchants, in essence, into industrialists. The basic nature of the putting out system was the recognition by merchants that large portions of the population of Britain were drastically underemployed. And most British citizens probably didn't think of themselves as drastically underemployed, but the realization was that most peasant households were very busy in springtime when they had to put the seeds into the ground, were very busy at harvest time when they had to bring in the harvest, but sat around and did much of nothing during the winter and the summer, and consequently could be used to expand the production of textiles. The problem with that is that the production of textiles required enormous skills, as tailors had to go through extensive training, and getting to peasants simply to produce textiles was not possible unless you reduce the process of making textiles to very, very simple steps and essentially train individual peasant households in those individual steps. One peasant household would be tasked with cleaning the raw wool. The next was simply combing out the raw wool. The next into spinning it into yarn. The next into weaving it into a cloth, and so on and so forth. Each of those individual steps was not particularly skill intensive, and introduced a technical division of labor within Great Britain. And a technical division of labor made a huge contribution, as those of you interested in this process might want to read the book Prometheus Unbound by David Landes, which is a brilliant account of this. In essence, if you think about mechanizing the production of textiles, and think about a tailor and how you would mechanize the functions of a tailor, it's pretty difficult to imagine. But if you reduce the various steps that are involved in producing textiles to ever simpler things that can be reproduced by untrained peasants, it becomes one step easier to imagine how you can mechanize each of those steps. And consequently, the first change, or the first spark in what David Landes calls a chain reaction of industrialization was the introduction of the spinning jenny. The spinning jenny basically mechanized the spinning of yarn and rapidly sped up the spinning of yarn, making it possible to produce more textiles. But how useful is it to spin yarn much faster? If you can't then weave it into cloth faster. Well, of no use whatsoever. You simply have the yarn piling up. In other words, that created an economic incentive to figure out how to mechanize a loom. And the mechanized loom, therefore, was a response to that basic problem. The mechanized loom increased the ability to produce textiles much faster. But the problem with looms, as well as with spinning jennies, is they require power. And power was not generally readily available. The only places that power was readily available was in concentrated places, like places where there were water wheels that were the first sources of power, and prisons, which were another source of power. Why were prisons sources of power? Well, what you might have seen as a joke in Simpsons cartoons of people walking on treadmills in the basement of a prison. That was a means of driving the machines that were located in the adjacent factory. In that sense, it's kind of ironic that now people pay access to get onto treadmills, whereas as opposed to being paid for running treadmills, and that treadmills nowadays suck power rather than producing power. But nonetheless. In essence, that dynamic in turn drove the entire process into a process of urbanization, of concentrating these enterprises more and more into cities. It went on to transform all of British society. The mechanization of textiles is useless unless you can create more of the raw material. But the raw material is produced on land that was used for the cultivation of all sorts of things. In other words, expanding textiles required converting agricultural land to pasture land. But that was not possible under feudalism in Great Britain because feudalism did not allow the lords to dictate how land was used, merely to collect a revenue from the land that was being cultivated by their peasants. And therefore, that the merchants that had enormous power and in many cases had enormous credits to the nobility in Great Britain insisted on changing the law. And changing the law such as to allow owners of property, the nobility, to do with that land whatever the heck they wanted, including kicking the peasants off of it. That in turn gave rise to the enclosures movement that booted large numbers of British peasants off of their land and forced them into cities. And in the cities they became the feedstock for the growing industries. But of course, once you can produce more wool in larger and larger areas, and you have your factories concentrated in cities, you need transportation to get the raw material to the market. And consequently, the technology that was the hallmark of British industrialism was the railroad. The railroad, in turn, and this is why David Landis calls this a chain reaction of industrialization, increased the demand for iron and steel and coal phenomenally. Iron and steel and coal had been exploited, but had been exploited in places where it was readily available and easy to process. The huge demand in iron and steel essentially necessitated digging deeper mines to gain access to those ores. But digging deeper mines is problematic. What happens when you dig deeper into the ground? Have any of you ever tried it? Well, you get to a certain point and your hole fills up with water, groundwater. And that means in order to run mines, you have to have pumping equipment. And in order to have pumping equipment, you need more iron. And you need to be able to process it better and more accurately and so on. In other words, it drove a technological revolution that converted Great Britain from a typical pastoral feudal society into an industrial powerhouse. But since this was driven by external demand, by demand from Spain and Portugal, and since the Spanish and the Portuguese became so wealthy by plundering the wealth of the Western Hemisphere, they very quickly found that they could only plunder that region once, and therefore the demand from Spain and Portugal started to dry up. And essentially, it's this situation that gave rise to a dynamic in Britain where its industry was inherently dependent on foreign markets, and therefore in search for foreign markets for its exports, and increasingly dependent on imports of foreign resources. And that, as you can probably anticipate, gave rise to colonialism. Colonialism in the British variety, which essentially incorporated those regions into of the world under control of Britain into their economy as suppliers of raw materials and as markets for their manufactured goods. The upshot of that is that the chain reaction of industrialization that started with a single spark of increased demand for British textiles from Spain and Portugal turned Great Britain into the workshop of the world and allowed it to develop a empire upon which the sun never set. Now, what should be fairly evident from all of this is that despite the strong belief by much of Great Britain that its empire was based on its moral responsibility to civilize the rest of the world, on what became known as the white man's burden to civilize the rest of the world, British colonialism had little or nothing to do with that. It was driven by economic interests. Economic interests that turned Britain into the workshop of the world and into the global hegemon during much of the 19th century. As the global hegemon, Britain maintained a free trade system globally throughout the 19th century, in which the Great British Pound essentially became the reserve currency in global trade. That clear dominance of Great Britain over its subsequent competitors like France, the Netherlands, and so on and so forth, allowed for the British to drop all restrictions on trade between their own colonies and Britain itself, and the colonial systems of its competitors like France and the Netherlands. It ushered in the first truly global process of liberalization that prevailed throughout the 19th century. You probably know much of the rest of the story. Suffice it to say that, as hegemonic stability theorists have long pointed out, in the 19th century, Britain, in effect, provided a number of public goods to the global community, such as safe and free and secure travel across the oceans through the dominance of the British Navy, such as a reserve currency in the form of the British pound, and Britain became the largest creditor on world markets. But each of those, and especially the maintenance of a powerful navy, and the maintenance of a reserve currency and so on, result in Britain incurring costs that its competitors do not have to duplicate. And in essence, therefore, leads to what realists call relative gains. Britain pursued this free trade system and was the main champion of free trade in the 19th century because it benefited its industries and allowed them to grow. But at the same time, it also benefited the growing industries in the United States and in Germany and in Japan, all of which grew but did not have to bear the expense that the British had to bear in terms of maintaining a large navy and so on and so forth. The upshot of that is that by the end of the 19th century, Britain had largely lost its monopoly on power in Europe and globally. It's in 1900 that Germany bypassed Britain as a industrial economy. And it's also roughly in 1900 that the United States bypassed Britain as a dominant manufacturing economy. Arguably, both the United States and Germany bypassed Britain long before that in terms of their technological prowess. The major inventions of the 19th century took place not in Great Britain, but in the United States and Germany. Britain may have been the first country to electrify its cities, but it did so by importing transformers that were produced by Siemens in Germany. And that, of course, then led to a determination to hang on to its dominant position in Europe and globally, which first and foremost focused on the rise of Germany. And there is considerable evidence that the elites within Great Britain, including the monarchy and the foreign policy brain trust that ran the Foreign Office, were determined by the 19th century to orchestrate a conflict with Germany at a time when Britain was still clearly superior in military power. Whether we want to blame Britain for the Second World War is an open question. You can read your history books and see which side of that you find more convincing. Obviously, the victors that ended the First World War determined that it was Germany that started the whole thing, but the picture is much more gray than that would suggest. Suffice it to say that Britain did not fare as well in the First World War as its elites had anticipated they would. But to a substantial extent came out weakened. Despite their victory. That was even more the case at the end of the Second World War. By the end of the Second World War, Britain had become largely a second-rate world power, which still had strong ambitions to maintain their former status. It went essentially in a period of less than a century from a empire upon which the sun never set to no empire at all. To a vastly diminished status as a power in the international system. It's in that context that we can understand some of the post-World War II foreign policies of Great Britain. The key figure, of course, in British politics, both in the First World War, in fact, even before the First World War, but in particular in the period leading up to and after the Second World War, was Winston Churchill. And Winston Churchill drew sort of the outlines of what British foreign policy and British ambitions would be in the aftermath of the Second World War, given the vastly diminished status of Great Britain as a military as well as an industrial power. In essence, his outline was what became known as the Three Circles formula, in which Churchill argued that while Britain was certainly vastly diminished in its overall power, both militarily and economically, it was still a crucial player in the international system and could continue to be a crucial player in the international system because, as he put it, Britain finds itself in the center of three circles. Unlike almost any other country on the planet. The three circles that he referred to was, first of all, the global circle, in which Britain may have lost its empire, but was keen to maintain its overall status through maintaining close relations with its former empire through the institutions of the Commonwealth. In that regard, Britain, to a considerable extent unlike France, and with some notable exceptions such as Kenya, recognized that the days when it could directly control regions around the world through a system of colonialism were numbered, and that the best means of dealing with the decline of British power, as was partially illustrated by the experience of India, was not to fight tooth and nail against independence, but rather to administer independence in such a way as to be able to preserve the economic ties between Britain and its former colonies. And it's indeed that process of empowering local elites within the former colonies that made it acceptable among those elites to maintain a close relationship with the Commonwealth. Had Britain fought tooth and nail against the independence movements and lost, it is unlikely that the leaders of those independence movements would have wanted to have any association with Britain, let alone being members of the Commonwealth. In that sense, it was very important to Churchill to maintain relatively close relations to the former colonies through the Commonwealth. Secondly, he argued that Britain is uniquely placed in the Atlantic Circle, by which he meant, to a considerable extent, the English-speaking world, and its relationship with the key players within the English-speaking world, not so much Canada, but notably the United States. He therefore articulated that Britain has and should continue to have a special relationship with the United States. One that critics of British foreign policy have described, especially in the context of Tony Blair's policy in the period leading up to the Iraq War, as the role of a lapdog. Of course, the British don't like to think of themselves that way. But it is certainly true that on most instances, the British have gone very closely along with the foreign policies of the United States, with some notable exceptions that we'll talk about in a minute. The third circle is the circle of Europe. And in that regard, Winston Churchill argued that Britain is certainly part of Europe, is certainly with Europe, but the way he put it, it's with but not of Europe. Meaning that he recognized the importance of a relationship between Europe and Britain in economic terms, in political terms, and so on and so forth, but suggested that none of these three circles should ever come at the expense of the other circles. In other words, the perception was that if Britain drew too close to the Atlantic Circle, in other words, to the United States, it would undermine its relationship with Europe, and it would undermine its relationship with the Commonwealth, given the rather controversial policies that the United States was pursuing, in particular in regions of the Third World, where the British were the former imperial powers. In the same sense, to draw too close to Europe would undermine their relationship with the United States and potentially their relationship with the Commonwealth. If it drew into Europe in a common market in Europe, the Europeans would insist on severing the relationship with the Commonwealth that still was based to a considerable extent on trade relations with those regions. To become entirely tied to the Commonwealth was itself impossible and would undermine its relationship with Europe. In other words, Britain has, throughout the period since the Second World War, kind of attempted to follow those basic dictates. It has continued to maintain its relationship with the Commonwealth. It has certainly maintained a relatively close relationship to the United States, and has always been the slow float in the flotilla of European unification. And in that regard, the withdrawal of Britain from the European Union is not altogether surprising, insofar as it became increasingly evident from the perspective of Europe, as well as from the perspective of Britain, that sitting on the fence was not going to be indefinitely possible. And Britain certainly sat on the fence with regard to the European Monetary Union, much to its benefit as it tries to withdraw from the European Union, because if it did not have the British pound at this point, it would have been much more complicated to figure out some kind of a means to withdraw from the European Union. It would have given rise to, for example, the problem that exists between Greece and the European Union, that if Greece, which has far greater reasons to withdraw from the European Union than Britain does, were to do so, in what denomination would it pay its debts to the European Union? It would have to have its debts denominated in euros. But if it restarts its drachma would probably be more or less worthless. In other words, it would be bankrupted in trying to pay off its debts. And that's one of the reasons why Greece has not been able to withdraw and is not likely to withdraw from the European Union. In that regard, Britain's reluctance to give up the great British pound was both a reflection of that overall dynamic, And one of the reasons, I think, why Britain has, to a certain extent at this point, recognized that either it's all the way in or all the way out, and decided, obviously, that it's all the way out. We'll see how that plays out. The fact that it's all the way out is, and that Brexit has now become almost a certainty, almost I say, because there's still quite a bit of uncertainty about exactly what form it will take, has enormous implications for British foreign policy and for British domestic politics in particular. It is very likely to destabilize British politics in its entirety, as is already becoming somewhat evident. Shortly before the Brexit referendum, Scotland held a referendum on independence. And that referendum lost by a very narrow margin. I think it was about 2%. When the referendum on the withdrawal from the European Union was held, the overwhelming majority of Scots voted to stay within the European Union, as did the majority of Northern Ireland. The majority of the English population voted to withdraw and won by a very narrow margin. Essentially, that means that a withdrawal from the European Union is likely to lead to the disintegration of Britain. The Scottish government has already asked for permission from Boris Johnson to pursue a second referendum, and all indications are that if Boris Johnson gave the permission for that, the withdrawal or the independence movement would win by a landslide and would seek to rejoin or remain a member of the European Union. In that regard, the United Kingdom no longer looks quite so united. But what is probably even more problematic is the situation in Northern Ireland and its relationship with the Irish Republic. The European Union and British membership within it is chiefly responsible for ending the troubles in Northern Ireland. In essence, because it made the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland largely symbolic. It was an open border with free trade and free connections. The imposition of a border between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic therefore creates enormous problems, especially for the Catholic population of Northern Ireland. That represents the majority within or close to the majority within Northern Ireland, and it's reproducing faster than its Protestant counterparts, and in that sense is likely to once again restart the troubles. The insistence that a hard border not go up between Northern Ireland and Ireland, which Mr. Johnson has so far abided by, has led to the suggestion that therefore the hard border should be created between Ireland and the rest of the United Kingdom in the channel between the island of Ireland and Britain. That would shut off Northern Ireland from Great Britain. And essentially is entirely unacceptable to the Protestant population or the British population of Northern Ireland. In other words, these are the kinds of circumstances, in rather extreme circumstances, that gave rise to what essentially amounted to a civil war that lasted for a number of decades in Northern Ireland, along with the explosion of terrorism by the IRA and other forces in the conflict throughout the British Isles. It will be very interesting to see how these things play themselves out over the next several years. Let me leave British foreign policy at that and see whether you have any quick questions or comments about anything that I've covered with regard to British foreign policy before I let you go today. No? Everything's crystal clear? I'm happy to see that, and thanks for your attention in that case, and we'll see you next week when we will be totally on schedule with our discussion of French foreign policy.
Professor, yes, I actually wanted to ask you so how does it like just the hard copy?
No, I'm going to post an announcement through Quarters.
Okay, so just for this and no for just for
I guess just the right.
Right. Oh, okay. I don't know why, but It looks on the whole pretty good. I think the one thing that I would emphasize is that what you should sources. But particularly what you want to try to do is emphasize the disagreement in the literature on Gilpin's office. You see that there's something that we disagree with that Russia invaded primarily more than Georgia Europe or NATO. Okay, I think you're on the right track.
I'm at the stage this week. I ran a few things by you. Quick things by you. If that's okay. So I just I completely understand. I've already emailed this, but I'll just pull it up right now. It'll only take 5 minutes of your time. That's okay. So if you're in a hurry, then.
Well, 5 minutes is try to make it fast. I'd love you to
So like you just said, we're going to be covering India and China as topics.
Yeah.
Could I recommend essay on that? Yeah, currently I'm doing it on Russia. Could I get like 3 days?
Unfortunately, the university is super strict that we have to stick to the guidelines that are on the syllabus, which state basically extensions of cases of family or medical emergencies. So I can't do that. What I can tell you is that the penalty is they've changed that here too. I'm not in control of the penalty. So it's out of my hands. It's the unfortunate. Which in some ways it could be because I don't think of it here. It's hard.
And I was like, thank you for your patience. You need to identify that's the people.